Hi, my name is David Small. I gave my life to Jesus over 17 years ago, and I'm here to tell you my testimony. I was born in 1972 in the city of Toronto, and I grew up in a small city/village called Malton, which some of you may know. And I remember growing up in Malton during the late 70s. It was a time of Rick James. It was a time of Led Zeppelin, and a lot of the older kids were into that stuff. For us, we grew up really influenced by the rap scene, and that really played into effect. And so later on, I remember just playing basketball for Westwood and attending Westwood, and my parents made the decision to move to Brampton, which was hard for me at the time. And I'll never forget, I started hanging around different places, started hanging around some friends and relatives in Rexdale, and started hanging in the Rexdale area, and just ended up giving myself to a lifestyle of just a young rebellion. And part of that young rebellion included crime. And one of the things I'll never forget is I was never really involved in shoplifting. I was never really involved in petty crime. But the first time that I ever got charged was for conspiracy to commit theft for $500,000. And I think at the time that took place, it really threw my parents for a shock. It really revealed to them some of the things that I was going through as a teenager. And I'll never forget, but those teenage years were very tumultuous for me. I began to give myself to sin. We would go to parties. I was heavily involved in, just doing rap music and demo tapes. And, it was very much part of the lifestyle for me as a teenager. And I remember my schooling began to be affected heavily. I was, involved in a lot of different crimes, and just my schooling, I ended up, attending over 7 different schools between Peel and the city of Toronto. And so I remember I came to a point where I got arrested for an incident, and I ended up doing a year in jail. And if you've never been arrested or you've never done time in jail before, I want you to know it's something that'll change your life forever. And I remember I was a young kid at the time. I was 17 years old, and I stood before a judge. And that judge, when he slammed his gavel, he gave me a 9-month sentence. And I remember when I entered into the jailhouse and entered into the facility, and I started to, live that criminal element, that lifestyle, I began to change as a person. And I remember as a young kid, I was very emotional. There were things that would, greatly affect me, but there was something about being sentenced and having the judge pass the gavel. It hardened my heart. I just didn't care anymore. And when I ended up going to jail, I learned a lot of things from a street level on how to survive. I learned how to harden your heart. I learned how to not care what people said about you, not care what took place. And I'll never forget, because when I left jail, I was 18 years old, and I said to myself, I am not going back. But someone had came and they had preached to me in jail, and they mentioned that sin is a cycle. And a lot of people would have doubts and say, oh, you'll be back. But I said, I'm not going back. I'm not going to give myself to crime. And I'll never forget, because 2 weeks later, I found myself as an adult in the East End Detention Center looking at possibly 5 to 10 years for a break and entry. And when that took place, I was broken. But I was broken to a point where I said, this is it. Either I'm going to be a criminal for life, this is going to be the rest of my life, this is what's going to mark me, or I've got to change. And I'll never forget, because something happened where I went to a bail hearing, and my father had met a lawyer. And this lawyer, for whatever reason, was moved by my father's story about his son, just getting out of jail and going right back again, that this lawyer said, I'm going to try to help you. And this lawyer went, and he actually got me out. I don't know what he did. He did a slick presentation. He talked to the judge. I'll never forget, they released me, and it was shortly after, as I was on the street, a gentleman came to me preaching the gospel. And when that gentleman came, and he began to preach to me about Jesus, he talked to me about heaven and hell. And as he spoke to me about being judged by God and either entering into heaven or entering into hell, I understood from the time that gavel dropped that there was an eternal destiny at stake. And then although I had messed up in other areas of life, if I would get right in this one area, that God could help me. And so today I'm saved, I'm living for Jesus, I have a beautiful wife and 3 children that I love dearly. And I just want to encourage anyone, if you're out there, perhaps you're not living for God, perhaps you don't know Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, I just want to encourage you that God is able to do great and abundantly above all that we ask or think.